Hello everyone from Ukraine. You're watching 24th News Channel. I am Andriy Drozda, and our guest today is Edward Lucas, a prominent British journalist, politician, and an expert on modern Russia. Mr. Lucas, glad to see you, happy to see you and hear you. Thank you for joining us today.
It's an honor to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so the main topic of our interview is, of course, related to the Russian war in Ukraine and its economic and security consequences. But this week we have a big shift, big changes in Great Britain's government. Boris Johnson has left his chair. Liz Truss will be the next prime minister. Why do you think the majority of the Conservative Party members voted for her and not for her rival Rishi Sunak?
Well, I'm not a Conservative. I'm a candidate for the opposition Liberal Democrats. So I look at this from 2 points of view. I'm rather worried from the point of view of the country. I'm quite pleased from the point of view of my own chances of getting elected to Parliament. I think that the long drawn-out leadership campaign highlighted the divisions in the Conservative Party and was not particularly enjoyable or impressive for the voters. I think that Liz Truss's main point was she had an optimistic approach to economics and sounds very decisive. My worry is that optimism is not enough, and that Mr. Sunak's more pessimistic approach to our economic difficulties was probably more realistic. But the good news is she's a big friend of Ukraine, and she takes the threat from Russia very seriously. She takes the threat from China very seriously. She is very keen to continue Britain's strong support both for Ukraine and for the frontline states in NATO. So that's a good start.
Yeah, Liz Truss indeed has a reputation of a very anti-Russian politician. We all remember her icy press conference in Moscow in February, I guess, so when she was very strict with Sergei Lavrov. Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov has already commented that Russia expects nothing good from Liz Truss and her government. What is your opinion? Will Liz Truss keep her pressure on Russia? And how about getting rid of Russian money inside the British economy? It was a problem in previous years, as far as I know.
Well, indeed, you've put your finger on it, that it's one thing to support the military resistance in Ukraine and to the strengthening of NATO's eastern flank. Dealing with our problems at home in Britain is more difficult. And this was certainly a big weakness of Boris Johnson's government, was that he was not willing to get to grips with dirty money, not just Russian dirty money, but Azeri, Kazakh, all sorts of people from all over the world come to launder their money and launder their reputations in London. And we need to do a much better job in resisting this together with the United States and our allies. I hope that Liz Truss will take this seriously. It doesn't seem to be an issue she's taken with particular emphasis so far, but certainly I will be keeping up the pressure here in central London, where I'm running for Parliament.
Okay, and your opinion, what kind of prime minister would be Liz Truss for a British nation? She said, I campaigned as a conservative and I will govern as a conservative. What do you expect from her work in her cabinet?
Well, I mean, conservatism is a very flexible term, and she likes to talk about being the successor to Mrs. Thatcher, and she projects herself as a kind of Thatcherite for the 21st century. And I have some difficulty with that. It's true that Mrs. Thatcher was very robust in standing up to the Kremlin, but she was also very much against borrowing large amounts of money, which future generations will have to pay back. And Liz Truss's plans for tax cuts and increased spending put a very big burden on the public finances, and our debt to GDP ratio, the national debt, is much greater now than it was when Mrs. Thatcher came in, and Mrs. Thatcher thought that was too high. So I worry that the financial markets are going to have something to say about this, and that we may see a sterling crash and a balance of payments crisis and some very severe economic difficulties. And I wonder how much this, what they call Trussonomics, will survive contact with reality.
Why do both leaders, the previous one and Liz Truss, previous one, I mean Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, make those publicly, those connections with famous leaders of British nation in history? Like Boris Johnson likes to compare himself with Churchill, and Liz Truss make this connection with Margaret Thatcher. Is it so important for them?
Well, I think that all countries tend to do this. You know, President Putin thinks of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. I know in Ukraine that the memory of Petlura and the great hetman of the past, and these other, the history of Rus before the name was stolen by Russia. And I think that it's this a rather selective approach to national glory is just a feature of politics. And American presidents love to compare themselves with Lincoln or Washington or whoever. I think that the difficulty is that historical circumstances are always changing, and the circumstances that Mrs. Thatcher had to deal with are very different from what we have now. So I'm keener for politicians to look at the future than to dwell on the past, because I think history deserves better than to be used as a weapon, whether it's historical events or historical personalities.
Got it. So Boris Johnson is extremely popular in Ukraine, but in Great Britain he does not have such a strong level of support, I would say. What heritage has Boris Johnson left after his 3 years as a prime minister, and does he have a chance to stay as an influential political figure, maybe even come back someday to Downing Street 10?
Well, Mr. Johnson is certainly telling his friends that he thinks he was pushed out of power quite unfairly, that he did a pretty good job, and that he would like to come back. And I think it's true that some important things did happen. He did get Brexit done, whether or not you think that's a good idea. But it was a political achievement to get the deal with the EU, and we left with a deal, which was better than just crashing out without a deal. And he handled aspects of the pandemic well, although I think in retrospect many people would say things could have been done differently. And he was certainly great on Ukraine. But I feel that Ukraine in a way was a big advantage for him. It gave him a chance for him to look good at home. And there were many jokes about whenever Mr. Johnson is in trouble at home, he phones up his friend Volodymyr Zelensky and he has a phone call or a photo op or whatever to try and distract people. And the fundamental problem with Johnson, and I've known him for more than 25 years, and although he's not a close friend, we're certainly acquainted, is the business of trust, that he doesn't take rules and norms seriously, and he's all through his career he's tried to get out of difficulties with clever jokes and unscrupulous behaviour. And I'm afraid that was his downfall, that he just wasn't willing to play by the rules which say that prime ministers shouldn't tell lies to the House of Commons. You should basically tell the truth. You should, if people have done bad things, they should take consequences of that. And he defended quite unreasonably people in the Conservative Party who'd misbehaved in their personal lives and deserved to be punished. He defended them, and in the end he burnt up all the trust and goodwill that he had when he started. And I'm afraid I was sad about that, but I wasn't surprised.
Okay, so let us switch to international politics and maybe talk a little bit more about Ukraine. You know, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky insists that Russia to be branded or labeled as a terrorism sponsor, but President of the United States, Joseph Biden, has a different opinion. On Monday, just yesterday, he said Russia should not be designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. Why does the United States still hold this position?
Well, I think that at the superpower level, there are still some relations between the United States and Russia, and I think that the Biden administration wants to keep some sort of political contacts, whether it's to do with space or with climate change or on nuclear arms control. And so I think they feel it wouldn't really help to designate Russia as a terrorist state. To me, what Russia's doing in Ukraine is terrorism. They are letting off bombs in populated areas that kill random civilians, and that to me is the classic behavior of terrorism. But I think these designations, whether you say it's the same argument really about whether you call something genocide or not, it can feel very satisfying at the time. You've set down a marker, you've shown that you really disapprove of something, but I wonder if these things really make as much difference as we hope. And I fear that if Russia was designated a terrorist state, it wouldn't make Putin think, oh, I have to change what I'm doing now. My goodness, if he designated a terrorist, he would just say, this proves what I've always said about the West, that they're very hypocritical. Why don't they say that about the Saudis?
Okay, so we have already 6 months of this war behind, and the Ukrainian army started a counter-offensive near operation near Kherson. Now, what is your forecast on this war? Has Putin already failed in achieving of his goals? And does the Russian army probably need a break for reinforcement?
Well, I'm not a military expert, so I'm very cautious about making any specific points about what's happening on the battlefield. I think that Putin had two big aims when he launched the war. One was to make Ukraine into a failed state, put it in a state of long-lasting political, psychological, economic, social tension, even torment, where it could never be a rival to his own project of the Russian world. And the second aim was to break Western willpower, show the world that the West is not really capable of sustaining support for its Ukrainian friends. And I think the jury is still out on both of these. I think for now, Ukraine has been amazingly resilient, and it's shown it has the ability to counterattack. It's fought Russia to a standstill, and the Russian army is in very difficult position when it comes to logistics, particularly on its exposed southern flank. So one can see circumstances in which this could end with a disorderly retreat of the Russians, and the Russians asking for negotiations and trying to find a settlement. But I also think there's a danger of things going the other way, that we face a very difficult winter. I wonder whether the economic crisis in the West will allow the level of support to Ukraine that we need, both military and economic. And this is a war of attrition. And the bigger party in a war of attrition does have some advantages over the smaller party. So I remain optimistic, but I'm cautiously optimistic, because I do think that there are circumstances in which things could go wrong. I think people sometimes overestimate the fragility of European public opinion. And although there is a minority in countries like Germany and the Czech Republic and others who say, let's just give up on this war, we are tired, as the Germans were saying, we're tired of the war, and let's just get the cheap gas. These views are really only on the political fringes, not in the political mainstream. Could Europe do better? Yes, it certainly could. Will Europe abandon Ukraine? I don't think so. But there will be a lot of economic stress, both caused by general inflation and recession, and also the specific question of the disruption of gas supplies. But I think that we will suffer a hit to our GDP. There will be some industrial production that doesn't take place. There will have to be a lot of financial help for households and probably small businesses as well. So we'll end up more poorer and in greater debt than we were. But I think Europe's a pretty big, rich place, really. It can afford to take some hits.
Okay, so the Russian blockade of Ukrainian food exports in Black Sea lasted for 5 months, I guess, and ended only in August. Does it mean that we have avoided this famine threats and all the deadly consequences for countries in Africa, Middle East, and so on?
We haven't avoided it, but clearly every shipment of grain that does get out is good, but we face a catastrophic combination of drought and war in the Horn of Africa, and we also have terrible problems in Pakistan as a result of climate change induced flooding. So we face, if it wasn't for the war in Ukraine, we're absolutely obsessed with this, and rightly obsessed with the extraordinarily miserable lives that are being experienced by tens of millions of people. And I think Putin's war has been a distraction from that. And even if the war stopped tomorrow, the world would still have very serious problems.
So do you believe that, talking about, Russian as a terrorist state, do you believe that Russia can create a real disaster in Zaporizhzhia nuclear station? But it looks like International Atomic Energy Agency are not capable to provide all the controls and security there.
I don't want to over-dramatize this. I'm clearly fighting around a nuclear power station is a very bad idea, and clearly the experience in Chernobyl shows the incompetence and stupidity of the Russian occupiers there, and one worries what they might do in the Zaporizhzhia plant. On the other hand, the wind blows in all directions, and I think the idea that Russia will try and create a dirty bomb in order to devastate Ukraine and intimidate Europe is probably not the way they would think, because if the wind changes, it'll blow northwards to Russia, and this would be a problem for them too. So I think it's more likely we have a disaster as a result of an accident rather than deliberately. As far as I know, and I'm not a nuclear expert, the main question is the cooling system for the nuclear fuel rather than the reactor itself. But I'm delighted that the international attention is drawn to this, and I would like to see a much stronger monitoring mission with a permanent presence there.
So some experts and analysts say that we are seeing the beginning of the end of Russian Federation as it looks today. It is an optimistic view, but how can Western countries prepare themselves for a possible collapse of Russia?
Well, I think we don't have a long-term strategy towards Russia, and for years we had extremely mistaken assumptions that Russia was basically a democracy and basically a market economy, and that basically we were going to get more friendly, and the priority was trade and investment and more political contact. Now that has proved to be quite unsuitable, and we are trying to find out some different strategy. Now, I would like us to have a strategy that includes the possibility, we prepare for the idea that the Russian Federation will change dramatically, because I think that fundamentally, and I've always argued this since the 1990s, the Russian Federation is unstable. It's based on a political clan in Moscow that loots natural resources from the resource-rich regions and collects bureaucratic rents, and then uses the proceeds of that to try and alleviate the fundamental tensions between the centre and the periphery. And that works well when the economy is growing and the voters are happy. But a war and the economic difficulties that they're facing push in the other direction. So I do think there's a danger of political chaos. There's I would say, a probability of political change in Russia. Whether that would be a peaceful evolution into some kind of confederation with much greater rights for regions and for ethnic groups, or whether that's a disorderly breakup on the lines of ex-Yugoslavia, I don't know, but I would be very glad if our political leaders would prepare for that and work out what they can do to deal with it.
In this situation, a lot depends on Russian political opposition leaders. Do you believe that Russian opposition, I don't know, Navalny or other ones, other groups, has a potential, they have a potential to change the country in a peaceful way after Putin passes away or just runs away from the country?
Well, history suggests that you get political change more often when a regime splits than when dissidents take power. And the dissidents may play a role, but usually they're working alongside, or sometimes even on behalf of, factions in the regime that don't like the way things have been developing. And that was true with the collapse of the Soviet Union, when you had Yeltsin playing a very important, the central role. It wasn't the distance were important public figures, people like Sakharov, who sadly didn't live to see the collapse of the Soviet Union, but some of the others. And it was the same in Ukraine as well. Ukraine, you didn't have Mr. Chernobyl becoming president. You had people like Kuchma and Kravchuk. So I suspect if there is change in Russia, it will be mainly within the regime. But I have the highest admiration for people like Vladimir Karamurza, my friend, who's in jail at the moment. I admire Navalny's courage, although I don't agree with many of his political positions. I'm very grateful to Garry Kasparov for the work he's done from outside. But it would be wrong to overstate these people's ability to pursue political change in Russia. Russia is a highly repressive country, and a large slice of the population basically thinks the war's a good thing and quite likes Putin.
Mr. Lucas, thank you very much for our conversation. I will be very happy to see you next time in our program. Thank you so much for your time and your answers.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. It was Mr. Edward Lucas, a prominent journalist from Great Britain, a politician and an expert on Russian policy. So see you next time with our new guest.